It said that the United States government, through the CIA, through the military, even through the mafia, tried to kill the commandante and leader of Cuba, Fidel Castro, over 638 times. I want to know why and how. So let's talk about it. I live in the United States of America, specifically a place called Georgia, specifically outside of a major city known as Atlanta, specifically within a county called Cobb County, specifically within a city called Marietta. I think history operates a lot like that. That we can explain it with the bigger picture, but it becomes more interesting the further we zoom in on the smaller details. It illuminates more, it gives us more of an idea of what's really happening. I'm 37 years old, I'm approaching 40, and that terrifies me. But in my life, I was born in a post Reaganomics world. I lived through several calamities, tragedies, life changing, world changing events, whether it be September 11th or the capitalization of democracy. I live in a world now where it seems, by all objective outward appearances, that my government tends to bend to the will of those with more money and more power. We have real struggles in my country. Maybe first world problems in comparison to other people's, but struggles such as wealth inequality. Struggles like persistent racism, anti Semitism, voices of unhinged right wing politicians and constituents being megaphoned, platformed. There are strikes constantly. Right now, there's one going from my union itself. We have a Supreme Court that is actively rolling back civil rights. And it seems like the administration of my country is only concerned with bathrooms on airplanes. It seems like there's massive disconnect. But growing up in a conservative state, when I learned about Cuba and Fidel Castro, it was in quick mention. The Cold War was already over by the time I was in elementary school, but the effects of it, the adamant hatred of communism in all of its forms was ever present. So Fidel Castro was painted as a villain, full stop. Oftentimes on par with someone like Hitler, Stalin. And maybe that's true. To be honest, I never learned enough about Fidel Castro to understand why he was so villainous. We never really were taught about the Cuban people's plight, about what happened. I know and I will admit that communism is something that always appealed to me, and why shouldn't it? The idea of helping your community, that everyone gets a fair shake, that's an appealing concept. Ideas of socialism and communism are bred into our understandings of what makes people good people. If you're a Christian, I was raised in a predominantly Christian nation, the idea of communism sort of baked into that. But at the same time, Americans, and I think all people, tend to vilify those that disagree with them by slinging out names. I don't like that person, therefore they're a child groomer, even though there's no evidence of that. I don't like that person, therefore they're a pedophile, even though there's no evidence of that. I don't like that person, they're a socialist, a buzzword, a keyword used by demagogues to demonize someone, asking them to forget the actual meaning and instead think it means opposition. Admittedly, I don't know a lot about Fidel Castro. And he might be the villain that I was always taught he was. I think in a lot of ways he is already, but I wanted to understand more about him. So when I heard that the American government tried to kill him over 600 ways, over 600 times, I became intrigued. And I thought that this would be a good opportunity to explore the smaller stories that are happening there and thus help me understand the bigger picture. Fidel Castro was born in 1926 in Cuba. His father, Angel Castro, was from Spain, Gatilian. His father served in the Spanish-American War, a war I know little to nothing about, and then found that he could make a lot of money in Cuba on sugarcane farms. Fidel's father, Angel's first marriage, failed. So upon moving to Cuba, he took his housekeeper for his mistress. They would have 6 children, I think. One of those being Fidel. Well, this is in the 1920s. And the world, inarguably, was a vastly different place. Fidel would grow up to be one of the most divisive figures in all of history, even while doing research on this first part. And please understand, I only have a small understanding of the full story as we speak. But even doing research for what little I know so far, it was interesting to see how divided sources were. Either a text will show full hatred and disgust by Castro or full admiration. There is no in between. And because of that, it's sometimes hard to find the truth of the facts. Fidel Castro, through a military coup, would take over the nation of Cuba. He would then become its prime minister, though arguably he was ruling the country through military force. I'll learn more about that later. That happened in 1959. It wouldn't be until the 70s that he becomes president of the country. It wouldn't be until in the 60s that the country becomes communist. It wouldn't be until the 2000s that he would step down as ruler. A lot of people say that his political journey began long before that he was an avid speaker, a protester, sought to be a senator, that he was even president of his university. But the last part's not true, actually. So the president of the University of Havana, the student president, was a man by the name of Enrique Ovares, and he's who we're going to talk about today. The American government tried to kill Fidel Castro over 634 times, but the person we start with was not American. The person we start with was one of Fidel's best friends. Fidel was born in the 20s in a state of Cuba originally called Oriente. It's not called that anymore. It's changed its name. He grew up relatively wealthy, but he was an awkward kid. Made a lot of mistakes, got into trouble. At the age of 6, he was sent to live with a Jesuit priest, and then enrolled into a private school. He was then kicked out of that school, moved to another private school, all religious schools. Family was devout Catholic. Eventually, as a teenager, he took up sports, baseball, basketball, more important. It was here that he meets Enrique. Enrique was a year older than Fidel, and both of them enjoyed playing basketball. At this point, in the late 30s, early 40s, it was a national pastime within the country. Both played in a Catholic league, different brackets and groups because they came from different areas. Enrique, like Fidel, was the son of a veteran. I don't know what war Ovares' father fought in. Ovares was well off, not as well off as Fidel. Ovares would eventually marry into a family that was extremely wealthy, but he was middle class. They both played basketball for Catholic leagues, but separate leagues, and often Enrique would have to be the referee for Fidel's games as they traveled and played in tournaments. Enrique initially was closer to a couple of Fidel's classmates, teammates. But eventually, both of them found their way to the University of Havana. Enrique was a year older, so he got there a little bit before and established his life within the political sphere that was emerging in the college. And remember, this is during World War II and post World War II. And it is hard to fully encompass how much the Great Wars changed the entire world. Not only by becoming the first truly international confrontations, but also showing people how dark and demented and devastating humanity can be. More importantly, perhaps, though, with the Second World War, we found that the mad viewings and political leanings and ambitions of one man can bring us to the brink of extinction. In the wake of this, and precipitating it barely by years, all over the world, the idea of communism, the idea of Marxism, Leninism, all three distinct different things, began to become very appealing to the youth. Youth had seen that the old ways of the world weren't working, that it was leading us to war, that it was leading us to devastation. Revolution is a young man's game. And I understand that once I was youth, once I was young. I think that a lot of times when massive life-changing events occur, we sort of question how the status quo led us here and what we need to do in order to break that status quo. I think about post-COVID. I think about all of the internal struggles and strikes that are happening now. How people are finding a new value of their own worth. And I think that's what happened here. Children saying that they don't want to live in the world their fathers created. I get that. And I think that's what Enrique and Fidel both experienced. At the time, the leader of Cuba was a man by the name of Ramon Grau. Ramon Grau was supported by the US. But he was corrupt. Cuban politicians had long had a history of not only corruption, but also ruling in what we might classify as a totalitarian sort of viewpoint. Grau would employ gang members to become his police officers, his enforcers. And yet the people of Cuba would categorize the revolutionaries being bred out of the University of Havana as something called gangsterismo. The idea that their politics were violent by nature. I don't know. I think revolution is always violent. I think new ideas are perceived by the old regard as violent. But that's not to say that violence didn't occur. Enrique, his second year of college, a student in architecture, became the president of the FEU, the basically college student body. And that position was one of significant importance. In the United States, we have hundreds of colleges to choose from. Not all of them are great. But in Cuba, you had one. The position carried with it a certain power, a certain responsibility. And Enrique Ovares, a man who was interested in architecture all of his life, said that prior to going to college, he didn't find himself a politically minded person. Fidel would say the same thing about himself. Enrique describes Fidel as being awkward, being a clumsy man, a man in a big body who didn't really know how to operate it yet. He said it was almost comical. He also says that Fidel was selfish. The Fidel was good at playing basketball, but never excelled at playing basketball because he didn't know how to be a member of a team. Fidel played for Fidel. In the 1940s, as these two young men grow through college, they find themselves in the middle of seeking political change, not only for themselves, but also for other countries within the Caribbean. In 1947, a proposed revolution happened. To take out the despondent leader, Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, Trujillo was endorsed by the United States government. But he was oppressing his people. And so college students from all over Latin America, from all over the Caribbean, had decided to band together and create a revolution by going into the Dominican Republic. Yet, Ramon Grau, under pressure of the United States, squashed this rebellion. There were other rebellions to be had. Enrique Ovares and Fidel Castro went to Colombia, to Bogota, and they stood with leftist speakers. They stood with leftist revolutionaries. They stood with protesters in peaceful protest until one of the leaders of the group was assassinated. Panic broke out. Riots in the streets. Police descending upon these young college-age students, killing them, slaughtering them. Students fighting back, breaking into a police station, stealing weapons. There's a famous picture of Fidel Castro holding a rifle from this moment, a rifle he stole from the police. A lot of critics of Castro would later say that Castro killed specific people within this riot. Enrique, who, without a doubt, is classified later in life as an opposition to Castro. Arguably, I would say he hates Castro with a passion. Yet even with that hatred, says that Castro didn't kill anyone during this. Instead, he was just defending himself. Instead, he was just trying to protect and secure the safety of all of those around him. Both boys and their entire delegation made it back to Cuba safe. I do want to reiterate, they were boys, young men. Enrique Ovares would be president of the university for 3 years. Fidel would serve many different roles beneath him as secretary of different committees, president of a few different committees as well, but never president of the college. Fidel would study law, Enrique would study architecture. After university, they would go their separate ways. Enrique would open up his own architecture firm and still remain in politics, although be it on a more localized level. Still contributing and helping on broader points, but not as active as he was. Fidel would open up his own law practice, specifically and exclusively helping the poor. It was a failing venture that bled money, but it was his passion. It was what he believed in. Grau did not seek re-election, but instead was replaced by a man named Prios. Prios was worse. Prios sought to tax the poor, increase the gang numbers amongst his officials and the police. Fidel continued to speak out about the injustices. Eventually, a party was formed, the People's Orthodox Party of Cuba, Partido Ortodoxo, so it was referred to as. And in this political party, Fidel found the person he believed that would change everything for Cuba, a man by the name of Chivas. Chivas was outspoken. Chivas had a radio show where he was not afraid to let others know about the corruption he had found within the government. Chivas was a charismatic, enticing, exciting figure, and Fidel Castro believed fully that Chivas would be the person to lead them into the next wave of prosperity, to be a figurehead that truly represented the people of Cuba. Chivas, on his radio program, had promised to give evidence about some of the corruption he had found. And on the night that he was supposed to do such, instead he spouted out more accusations and condemnations of the current state of the government. And as he turned off his broadcast, he put a gun to his gut and shot himself. Fidel Castro was in the room. It was an attempted suicide, but it was thought that Chivas would live. But 11 days later, from infection and sepsis, he succumbed to his wounds. So now the promising star that was going to rise and lift Cuba out of its despair and disparity was gone. So Castro decided he had to do something about it himself. He was a charismatic lawyer. He was a riveting speaker. And people listened to what he had to say, but more importantly, he listened to what people had to say. Most people that describe him, regardless of if they hate him or loved him, would always say that that was his power, his strength, was the ability to listen to you and make you think you were the most important person in the world. That he really heard you. So Castro sought out to become a senator, speaking to other political candidates that wanted to lead and usher in this new life for Cuba. He found a man by the name of Batista. They became allies, promising to assist one another in their political rises. That was a promise Batista wouldn't necessarily follow through with. In 1952, using military force, Batista engaged in a political coup and overtook the country, sending Prios into hiding. Batista said that what the country needed now was disciplined democracy. He was the one to discipline the people. So from the 1940s to now 1952, a decade, we've gone from one tyrannical ruler to another to now a military takeover. In the years that followed, Fidel saw no other option but violence. So, in an attempt for his own political coup, he tried to commence a revolution that failed. Got him a year in prison. After he served his year, he fled to Mexico, where, along with other co-conspirators and Che Guevara, he established a movement that would come back to Cuba in 1959 and begin a new revolution, this time a successful revolution. During all of this, Enrique Ovares was living his life. He was married, he was having children, he was a successful architect, still speaking about the principles that he believed in. And some of those principles aligned with what Fidel Castro was speaking about. The government's responsibility to help lift the people who need it the most. Both spoke about anti-American imperialism. Both spoke anti-imperialism altogether. And though their lives had separated some, they still knew of each other. They still saw each other. But Enrique noticed a change in Fidel. There's a word that oftentimes people will use to describe Fidel Castro during this period. Lepro. A lot of people think it's derived from the word leper. It's leproso. Lepro also has a shady connotation to it. Originally, it meant something like the poor people, the downtrodden. But it came to have a different connotation to it. A lot of times throughout cultures, people perceive the rich, the aristocratic, the wealthy to have an air of education and sophistication about them. So it only makes sense if the rich people are the opposite of the poor, that each would have an antithesis of qualities about them. So the assumption became that poor people were uneducated, unsophisticated, rude, uncouth, coarse. So eventually, lepro came to mean that. A person that was rough around the edges, that you didn't know how they would behave. Social pariah, you didn't want to be around because you never knew what they were going to do. Fidel, in the midst of all of this turmoil, had become more paranoid, more distrusting. He had started off idealistic, a boy who was speaking about the complications and the troubles and the worries of the world, a boy who sought to use his intelligence to help the poor people of his country. And now he was turning into a soldier that trusted no one. And as Castro's revolution became successful, Enrique Ovares and others became worried. What happens when a psychopath takes over? Enrique Ovares cites an old adage. If you want to get rid of the rabies, you have to kill the dog. So with a group of co-conspirators and Castro's new government still in its infancy, Ovares sat down and constructed a plan of how to eliminate what he saw and others saw as the potential biggest threat to Cuba, their beloved country. And the solution they came up with was kill the dog. Several of them would be armed. They would go to a public location that they knew Fidel would be. There would be a signal, and all would open fire at the same time. They knew that not all of them would survive. It didn't matter how many of them lived. They were just increasing their chances of getting the job done. With 7 men shooting, the likelihood that one bullet at least would kill him was a good bet. but slowly. But as the fateful day approached, fate had other plans. 7 conspirators. 3 were arrested. 1 was executed in his home. 2 chickened out. So the only one left was Enrique Ovares, the man who knew Fidel. Enrique Ovares, the man who had known Fidel, who had been friends with Fidel, who had stood through riots with Fidel, who had given speeches with Fidel about their shared dreams. On the day of the intended assassination, Enrique would not let his bravery waver. Instead, he tucked a pistol into his pocket and went, and by foot he walked to a cafe on a corner of a street, a small town that he and Fidel had played basketball together over 15 years prior. Fidel was now surrounded by men. At this point, he was not the president. That wouldn't happen for another 20 years. He was just the prime minister of a government that hadn't fully formed. The revolution had just taken place. Batista had left maybe a month prior. As Enrique walks into the restaurant, Fidel sees him. Fidel recognizes him. No one thinks anything of it. Enrique is a revolutionary himself. And so all of Fidel's armed men do nothing. They sit there. It's a friend come to eat at the restaurant and say hello to a comrade. It's at this point that, according to the plan, Enrique was meant to reach into his pocket, pull a gun, point it at the man that he was convinced would be the demise of Cuba, and pull the trigger, saving thousands and potentially millions of lives. Enrique places his hand in his pocket. He grips the gun as tight as he possibly can. He stares Fidel in the face. And he begins to cry, realizing he can't pull the trigger, realizing he can't even pull the gun. Fidel's men, realizing something is amiss, tackle Enrique. When searching him, they find the weapon. A short investigation reveals he is one of the conspirators. Enrique is thrown into jail for 7 years. After the 7th year, he is released, escapes Cuba, flees to the United States, starts a new life in Miami, never forgiving himself for what he wasn't able to do. Enrique has a bitterness that I can understand. I think patriotism is an interesting thing. I love my country, but I don't have any shirts with the American flag on it. I don't think America is perfect. I think we commit atrocities. I think we have systems that are rotten from the core. I think there's a lot of possibilities. I think there's a lot of opportunities. I think there's a lot of rich history and culture. And I think there's a good people here. I think there's a good people everywhere. But I think to love something is also to be able to see the flaws and the potential it has. There's a difference between loving something and following it blindly. I think there are very few things I follow blindly. My pets. I love them blindly no matter what they could possibly do, but I think people are fallible. I think systems are fallible. I think they can become corrupted over time. I read a lot of what Enrique Ovares said in the years prior to his death about his experience with Fidel Castro, his experiences fighting for Cuba, and his never-ending love for his homeland. I think loving potential, having hope for it, is an important thing. It gives us a connection to the intangible. But I think ideas, I think revolutions, I think people, they are all subject to the process of rot. If I believe Enrique Ovares about the things that Fidel Castro became, he rotted from the core and became all of the things he preached against, he spoke against, he fought against. I don't know those tangible things yet, but I look forward to finding out in the most clinical of ways. You know, the interesting thing is I'm a person who, I'm interested in a lot of things in this world. But Fidel Castro was never one that was on my radar. It was never on my list. It was just an assumed, he's the bad guy. He's the guy that we fight. Enrique Ovares was not the first person to attempt to kill Fidel Castro, but it's an interesting story about a man who considered him a friend, a colleague, an ally, a person who had been with him in the worst of possible situations, deciding he is not worth saving. Was Enrique Ovares ever really Fidel's friend? Or did Fidel become something so dangerous it had to be killed? Maybe we'll find out next time.